The desert night was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Yet in that darkness there were footprints even Shaitan would hesitate to follow, not because of a fortress, not because of an army, but because of one man's sincerity, a man whose presence made wrongdoers swallow their pride, a man whose words felt heavier than chains, a man whose strength protected the weak, and whose tears soaked the prayer mat when no one was watching. His name shook empires and lifted the oppressed. He was not a prophet, but history bent around him. Umar ibn Al-Khattab. And yes, this is a true story, more intense than fiction, because it happened in real streets, under real skies, with real hearts. If you're reading this right now, take a breath. Imagine the heat. Imagine the sand. Imagine Makkah before Islam was welcomed, when arrogance walked openly and the poor learned to be quiet. And before we go deeper, drop a comment in your mind. Where are you reading from? A room? A bus? A night shift? A quiet corner after Salah? Wherever you are, come with me. The sun once poured down on Makkah like molten gold. In the marketplace, pride was currency and bloodlines were law. Men spoke loudly. Alliances were traded like goods. And the Kaaba stood surrounded by idols that had become tradition. In that world moved Umar, tall, broad-shouldered, and certain of himself. His stride didn't ask for permission. It announced its arrival. When Umar spoke, voices lowered. When he walked, arguments paused. Warriors respected him. Negotiators relied on him. Even those who disliked him avoided his gaze, because his eyes carried the sharpness of a man who did not blink before conflict. Quraysh trusted him with disputes and delicate missions. He understood status, language, and leverage. He was not only strong in body, he was strong in presence. But at that time, his heart had not yet been opened by faith. Not yet. To Umar, Islam looked like disruption, like rebellion, like a crack in the wall that kept Quraysh standing tall. He watched the small band of believers gather quietly and thought, this will weaken us. This will divide families. This will challenge our gods, our pride, our inherited power. He mocked them. He spoke against them in gatherings. He defended the idols of his ancestors as if he were guarding honor itself. Yet destiny was already moving, unseen. Sometimes Allah does not choose the easiest hearts to carry truth. Sometimes He takes the hardest, the most stubborn, the most powerful, and breaks the walls of arrogance with the same force those walls were built. Inside Umar, there was a fire. Fierce, restless, demanding meaning. It burned for something bigger than tribal rivalries. And that fire was not meant for idols. It was meant for Allah. People said His name with fear. Mothers warned sons to avoid Him. Merchants lowered their volume when He passed. If a quarrel was about to explode, His presence could end it before the first blow. In Makkah, Umar was a lion among men. And yet, before the decree of Allah, even a lion is simply a servant waiting to be guided. Then came a day when anger wrapped itself around him like armor. The desert heat clung to his skin as he moved through the streets, jaw tight, hand close to his sword. For months, frustration had been fermenting inside him. Muhammad's message was spreading, and Umar could feel the balance shifting. Families were splitting. Slaves were standing taller. The weak were speaking with a confidence that made the powerful uncomfortable. Enough, he told himself. Enough division. Enough insults to the gods. Enough of this new way. In his mind, he made a decision that felt like duty. He would end it. He would silence Muhammad, and in doing so, protect the structure of Quraysh. He walked with purpose, the kind that makes people step aside without being asked. The blade at his side was more than metal, it was a promise. But beneath that fury lived something quieter, something he never admitted. A fear that the words he hated might carry truth. On the path, a man met him, careful, hesitant, reading Umar's face like someone reading storm clouds. "Umar," he said softly, "before you go after Muhammad, shouldn't you look at your own home? Your sister and her husband have already accepted his message." The world tilted. His sister, his own blood. Betrayal rose in him like a flame. He turned without thinking, sword flashing in the sun, and headed toward her house. Each step was heavy with rage. He reached the door and burst in, and the room froze in a silence that only fear can create. Inside, His sister and her husband had been reciting from a parchment verses of the Quran. Their voices had been gentle, trembling with hope. The parchment was hurriedly hidden, but Umar had already seen the light in their eyes, the kind of light that cannot be faked. "Is it true?" he thundered. "You followed him?" His brother-in-law stepped forward. His voice shook, but it didn't break. "Yes, because what he brings is the truth." The blow came fast. Rage blurred Umar's vision. A struggle, a shout, the sound of flesh meeting flesh, then an awful stillness. His sister moved to protect her husband, and Umar struck her too. When she stepped back, there was blood, a streak at the corner of her mouth. But she did not collapse into fear. Her tears came, yet her voice stayed steady. "Yes, Umar," she said. "We believe. Do what you want, but we will not turn back." In that moment, something cracked inside him, not in anger, but in confusion. This was not the stubbornness of fools. It was strength, a calm, unshakable certainty he did not understand. His eyes fell on the parchment. Dust and blood had touched it, yet it looked pure. "Give it to me," he demanded. But his voice was different now, less like a roar, more like a man trying to hold himself together. "You are not clean," she replied gently. "Wash first, then read." Imagine that. The Lion of Quraysh, whose name made people tremble, walking out to wash himself before words he once mocked. He returned, sat down, and began to read. The verses often associated with Surah Taha in this story flowed through him like water carving stone. Each line struck the armor around his heart. This was not poetry. This was not the clever speech of a magician. It carried a weight that made his chest tighten and his hands tremble. For the first time in his life, Umar felt small, not weak, but humbled, like a mountain realizing it stands under a greater sky. He looked up, eyes changed. The sword was still there, but its purpose was dissolving. "Take me to Muhammad," he said. A whisper, but it shook the room. "Take me to him." The hunter became a shield. When Umar walked toward the Muslims, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The believers had been meeting quietly, hiding their prayers, counting their footsteps, listening for danger in every sound. They knew Umar's name. They knew his temper. They knew his strength. When he approached, some hearts tightened, expecting a trap. But Umar entered with a face that had been broken open by truth. He declared his faith. The man who once vowed to destroy Islam now stood as its defender, and the balance of power shifted in a single night. Soon after, Umar did something that echoed across Makkah like thunder. He went to the center of Quraysh's pride. He stood near the Kaaba where men gathered, where idols stood like silent witnesses to arrogance. The marketplace hushed as people recognized him. It was as if the air itself paused. Then Umar lifted his head and declared, with a voice that used to command warriors, "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." Each word hit like a hammer against the idols. Some laughed nervously. Some stared, unsure whether to deny their eyes. No one had dared to stand there and announce allegiance to the man Quraysh hated most no one until Umar. And something else happened. The Muslims, who had lived in the shadows, began to step forward. One by one, faces that had been hidden appeared in the open. They were still afraid, but their fear now had company. Umar stood like a mountain beside them. He looked at them and said, "Why do we hide? Are we not upon the truth?" Together, they walked. Together, they prayed openly. The takbir rose into the sky without being muffled by walls. Shoulder to shoulder, they stood in the sunlight, and Quraysh watched powerless, stunned. That day, fear changed sides. The oppressors felt the weight of something they couldn't measure. The oppressed felt what it meant to stand in the open with a shield of courage beside them. From there, Umar's story did not soften. It sharpened. Years passed. The world moved. The believers migrated. Medina became home. The message became a community, a civilization, a responsibility. And Umar, once a fierce opponent, grew into a pillar whose justice would become legend. When Umar later led as Amir al-Mu'minin, he did not sit behind gates. He did not build a palace to separate himself from the people. His cloak was worn, his sandals were patched, his food was simple. But when he walked, the world straightened its spine. because he carried accountability as if it were a visible weight on his shoulders. His power did not come from fear. It came from a belief that Allah sees everything. Under his rule, the poor, the traveler, the stranger from distant lands all could find safety. He believed that leadership was not a privilege, it was a test. And in his time, justice was not a slogan, it was a living force. There is a famous story that has crossed centuries. A young man from Egypt came all the way to Medina. He was tired, dusty, and determined. He did not come seeking wealth, he came seeking justice. He had been beaten by the son of the governor of Egypt, a boy of status who struck him with arrogance and reportedly said, "I am the son of the noble." Think about that sentence. It's the kind of sentence that ruins societies, the kind that tells the weak to accept humiliation as fate, the kind that makes tyrants comfortable. The young man stood before Umar with no throne in sight, no gold, no ceremony, just truth. Umar listened in silence, the kind of silence that makes liars nervous. Then he summoned the governor's son. Soon the oppressor and the oppressed stood face to face. Umar's gaze was steady, like cold fire. He handed the young man a whip and said, "Strike him, for he struck you." Gasps filled the room. The son of a governor punished publicly? In a world where status often buys immunity? But Umar saw no bloodline, no title. He saw only right and wrong. The whip cracked, and with each strike, arrogance tasted the bitterness it once served others. Then Umar spoke words that still live on tongues. "Since when do you enslave people when their mothers bore them free?" The governor lowered his head in shame. The boy who thought he was untouchable learned that in Umar's rule, no one stood above accountability. Umar turned to the young man and reminded him, "You have taken your right, and know that under this rule, superiority is only in Taqwa." This was Umar, a man who could have ruled with fear, but chose to rule with the Quran. He tore down walls of injustice instead of building walls around his power. Now here is the part that social media clips often miss, the side of Umar that makes the heart tremble. Because strength without humility is just ego wearing armor. Umar's greatness was not only in the courtroom, it was in the night. When the city slept, Umar would walk the streets. No guards, no torchbearers, no announcement. Just him and his conscience. He listened. He watched. He checked whether anyone was hungry, whether anyone cried alone, whether any household had been forgotten by the system. And then, when he returned, he would pray. In the empty masjid, he would stand and recite Quran until his voice broke into a whisper. The same man who commanded armies in daylight trembled like a leaf in the wind before Allah at night. His beard would become wet with tears. He feared nothing in this world, no king, no army, no enemy. But before his Lord, he feared the day when every soul stands alone. He used to speak to himself with harsh honesty. "Woe to you, Umar, if Allah does not forgive you." That is the secret. That is why shayatin flee from a heart fortified with remembrance. The Prophet ﷺ said, "By the one in whose hand is my soul," whenever Satan meets Umar on a path, he takes a different path. It wasn't because Umar was merely fearless. It was because sincerity makes darkness uncomfortable. It was because a heart anchored to Allah becomes a fortress that the unseen recognizes. And while Umar's inner world deepened, the outer world changed. History began to move quickly. Empires that once seemed immovable started to tremble, not only because of swords, but because of a new standard: justice. Under Umar's leadership, the banner of Islam reached lands that had been ruled by oppression. Persia, vast and proud, fell. The Byzantines were pushed back. Cities opened their gates. People who had lived under crushing burdens began to breathe. But here is what makes Umar's story different from many rulers. The expansion did not expand his ego. It expanded his fear of Allah. He remained the same man in patched clothes, walking through Medina like a servant among servants. When governors arrived, they did not find him seated on a throne. They found him sitting in the sand, listening to the poor, laughing with those who had nothing to offer him but dua. He could have lived like a king. He could have wrapped himself in silk and surrounded himself with gold. Instead, he chose simplicity, because luxury felt like betrayal if anyone in his community went hungry. At times he carried sacks of flour on his back, delivering them quietly so no one would praise him. His witness was Allah. It is said he worried even about animals and roads. fearing he would be questioned about neglect. "If a mule were to stumble in Iraq," he reportedly said, "I fear Allah would ask me why I did not pave the way." Whether you hear that as a literal quote or as a lesson carried through narration, the message is clear. Leadership is responsibility down to the smallest detail. This is the kind of mindset that rebuilds societies. Not speeches, not slogans. Accountability. Now, take a moment and think. How many leaders today check on the hungry at night? How many fear being questioned for a stranger's pain? How many would publicly correct their own governors? If you feel your chest tighten reading this, that's the heart recognizing a standard. And Umar's story did not end in a palace, surrounded by guards. It ended in the most honest place possible, in the house of Allah. One dawn in Medina, believers gathered for Fajr. The air was cool, the lamps flickered softly, and rows formed shoulder to shoulder. Umar stood at the front calm, composed, unaware that this prayer would be his last on earth. When he raised his hands for takbir, there was no sign of fear in him, only the tranquility of a man who spent his life walking toward his Lord. But within the crowd moved a man carrying hatred and a hidden blade. In the stillness of sujud, the blade struck. Steel met flesh. A gasp spread through the masjid like a wave. Umar staggered. Blood darkened the prayer rug. Chaos erupted. But Umar's voice, faint, yet steady, cut through it. He urged the believers to continue the prayer. Even then, even as life slipped away, worship remained above himself. That was always his strength. Islam was bigger than Umar. They carried him to his home. His face grew pale. His clothes were soaked with blood. Companions gathered, hearts heavy, feeling that the earth was about to lose a mountain. Umar asked questions not about revenge, not about his legacy, but about the Ummah. Were people safe? Was the prayer completed? At the edge of this world, his heart was still with responsibility. And then he turned to his Lord with the humility of a servant. The man who once roared like a lion, left in a whisper of surrender. The blade pierced his body, but not his legacy. Blood can dry, but justice leaves a stain of light that time cannot erase. His nights of tears and days of strength became a torch for generations. If you ever wonder what real power looks like, remember Umar. Real power is not domination. It is self-control. It is standing for the oppressed, even when the oppressor is connected to you. It is simplicity when wealth is available. It is fear of Allah when crowds chant your name. It is weeping in secret more than you smile in public. And if you're reading this in an age of noise where everything is a clip, a post, a trend, take this as a reminder. Faith is not a performance. Umar's courage did not come from a camera. It came from a heart that lived as if the Akira was close enough to touch. So the next time you feel weak, remember the day the strongest man in Makkah washed himself and bowed before words. The next time you feel hopeless, remember the night Umar carried food on his back while the city slept. The next time you see injustice, remember the whip in the hand of an oppressed stranger and the sentence that shattered arrogance. Since when do you enslave people when their mothers bore them free? Share the lesson in your own way, in your character, in your dua, in your choices. And if this story moved you, let it move you beyond emotion into action. Pray with more presence, speak with more truth, treat people with more justice, because that is the legacy Umar left behind. A life that made even the unseen change its path, not out of superstition, but out of awe for sincerity. May Allah be pleased with Umar ibn Al-Khattab, raise us with the righteous, and grant our hearts a share of the fear and love that turns lions into servants and servants into legends. People later called him Al-Farooq, the one who distinguishes truth from falsehood, because after his Islam, lines became clearer. He didn't keep faith as a private secret. He carried it the way he carried everything, openly. And that openness mattered. Before Umar, many believers measured every step, afraid of being dragged through the streets. After Umar, they began to breathe in public. There is a scene that many narrations paint with slightly different colors, but the meaning is consistent. When the Muslims prepared to migrate from Makkah, most slipped away quietly. Umar did not. He is described as circling the Kaaba, praying, then facing Quraysh and warning that whoever wished to orphan their children or make their wife a widow could meet him outside the city. Whether you take every detail literally or see it as a portrait of his courage. The lesson is undeniable. Faith turned his fearlessness into protection, and his boldness became a shelter for people who had none. In Medina, he stayed close to the Prophet ﷺ, learning not only how to fight, but how to soften. Umar was strong, but he was also teachable. He would ask, reflect, correct himself. He didn't treat guidance like an insult. He treated it like rescue. And that is a rare kind of strength. Later, when leadership came to him, he treated it like a burden placed on his neck. He built systems not to glorify himself, but to serve people. He appointed governors and held them accountable, questioned their wealth, listened to complaints, and welcomed criticism. He created a culture where a common person could speak to the ruler without being crushed by protocol. Imagine that. A society where the powerful expect to be questioned. During years of hardship, when famine struck what many refer to as the year of a Ramada, Umar did not eat rich food while others starved. He is described as limiting himself, refusing ghee and meat, living with the people's pain until relief came. He would stand with hollow cheeks and a heart on fire, making dua, organizing aid, and moving like a man who believed he would be questioned for every hungry stomach. And he had a way of teaching that wasn't built on long lectures. Sometimes it was a glance that corrected. Sometimes it was a simple statement that shook a room. Sometimes it was an action no one expected from someone in his position, like carrying food himself, like sleeping on the ground, like walking at night to learn what daytime reports would hide. That's why his story still hits today. Because it answers a modern question with an ancient life. What does integrity look like when you actually have power? It looks like this. You don't use authority to protect your ego. You use it to protect the vulnerable. You don't surround yourself with people who only praise you. You surround yourself with people who tell you the truth. You don't confuse fear with respect. You earn respect through fairness. And you don't treat religion like decoration. You treat it like a compass that decides your direction, even when it's inconvenient. If you want a takeaway, you can carry into your day like a pinned note. Let it be this. Umar wasn't feared by Shaitan because he was angry. He was feared because he was aligned. His private self matched his public self. His strength had a spine, and that spine was Taqwa. When a heart is that anchored, temptation finds no easy handle to grab. So whether you're reading this between classes, between meetings, or in the quiet of your night, let the story do what it was meant to do. Wake you up gently, not into despair, but into direction. Let it remind you that one person, when sincere, can change a city, and one city, when just, can change the world. And if you share anything from this, share the standard, not the hype. Quiet justice, hidden tears, courage with humility. May Allah grant us hearts that choose the right path when Shaitan whispers, and may He let us meet him with clean hands and a soft, truthful soul.